Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to welcome Anna Muenchrath, who will be presenting today on just browsing time in the online bookstore. She's an assistant professor of English in the Department of Arts and Communication at Florida Tech, I guess the Florida Institute of Technology, more formally. Her research interests include 20th and 21st century literature, theories of world literature and cultural production, literary sociology, translation studies, print culture, media studies, and book history. And she has two books out at the moment: Making World Literature, Actors, Institutions, and Networks in the United States since 1890, with Princeton University Press, and Selling Books with Algorithms, now out with Cambridge University Press, which I encourage you all to purchase, but is also free as a downloadable PDF through the website. So without further ado, take it away, Anna.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Is that good? We can all see that? Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you also to Sam and Evan, who's not here, for their support in publishing the element and also in hosting the talk today. All right, I'll jump in. So this talk is in some ways predicated on the idea that there's a kind of privileged relationship between books and the passing of time. So obviously, as we read, time passes, sometimes more than we'd wish. But time is also passing somewhat differently in the books that we read. So, for example, we may read about a year or two or a decade or more in the span of an hour. Or maybe if we're reading Proust or more recently Ben Lerner, we might spend an hour or two reading about what takes only a few seconds to elapse in the plot of the book. So in this sense, plot is something like a time machine, warping our experience of time, and perhaps this is like one of the many time puns I'll be making, leaving us in search of our own lost time. So, time, its saving, and particularly its redistribution, has become central not only to the reading of books, but also to the buying and selling of books online. In this talk, I'm going to be thinking through one of the threads that ended up winding its way through my recently published Cambridge element on selling books with algorithms. The element focuses on how Amazon's use of algorithms has reshaped book selling and book buying. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on the relationship between algorithms and time, and particularly speed. So I'll start by thinking theoretically about algorithms' paradoxical relationship to time. For example, they're programmed to increase the amount of time that we spend on a site, but they also function by executing nearly instantaneous calculations that reshape the site every time we click. Then I'm going to think more materially about how algorithms co-opt and reuse the time of the online user, so that's you and me when we're browsing online, and how that compares to the way that algorithms regiment the time of the Amazon warehouse associate, whose daily schedule is created through algorithmic logics. I'll end by comparing the time of the traditional bookstore, epitomized in the idea of browsing, with the new regime of time instituted by algorithms in the online bookstore. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. And I just want to give you a note about timing. When I timed this presentation before, it was about 32 minutes, so just know that there is an end in sight. Okay, so algorithms are sets of procedures that operationalize the completion of a task. So imagine you're a bookseller. Some of you may already be booksellers, so this won't be very difficult. Imagine you're a bookseller and you need to decide which books you should stock in the limited high visibility shelves and tables of your store. You might consider the attractiveness of the covers, the anticipated popularity of the titles, as well as how much press or buzz each of the books has already received. You might take into consideration what has sold well in the past, as well as your sense of the preferences of your regular customers. The profit margins on each book might come into play, as would any marketing agreements you have with publishers to feature certain titles prominently. So whether consciously or not, you would weigh a mixture of these inputs to make your selections. And so this, as you can see, is the front table um, of a Chicago bookstore, right, with particularly, I think, attractive covers selected for display. Algorithms, in the way that we think of them working on a computer, can take inputs like these, rapidly complete an operationalized procedure, and produce a best result, where best is determined by the setting of pre-programmed goals. So this is the front page of my Amazon Bookstore, the one associated with my IP address. This is a little bit like standing naked in front of an audience because you can maybe deduce some things about my life from what my bookstore looks like. So as in this example, algorithms often simulate or stand in for human judgment, which is why they're also called automated decision systems. They formalize the process of weighing multiple inputs to get effective answers, but they do so in a way that's automated, and once algorithms have been set up, relatively autonomous, so that the decisions can be made, quote, instantly, repetitively, and across many contexts, away from the guiding hands of its implementers. To do this, the relevant inputs need to be turned into measurable data. The function of recommendation algorithms, like the ones that inform you of books you might like or books that are similar to the ones that you're looking at, those are essentially predictive. They use the data they have to extrapolate a prediction for a data point that doesn't yet exist. So given that you bought books A, B, and C, for example, what book will you buy next? In early recommendation algorithms, the data for this calculation was often explicit. So users would provide ratings for a set of products, right? So you just like you are on Netflix or on Amazon, right? And you rate the show you just watched or you rate the book that you just bought. Those are explicit, that's explicit data that you're producing. By accessing a model of how products related to each other, algorithms would then predict a user's rating for a product that they had not yet rated. As online data collecting became more robust, algorithms were able to use implicit ratings or data proxies. This means things like clicking and scrolling on certain parts of the site, spending more time on one page than another, stopping and rewatching a video, or listening to a song multiple times. Since algorithms cannot get a sense of, for example, the browsing habits of in-person consumers, so things like increased traffic at a certain table, the body language or comments to bookstore staff, data proxies need to be created to measure this kind of interest, such as time spent viewing a page or time spent scrolling a list of recommendations. By tracking the time users spend through cookies, IP addresses, and individual profiles, platforms like Amazon create user portfolios that replace traditional market demographics or user ratings with user preferences measured by the amount of time they spend completing certain online tasks. So rather than relying on users to make a self-conscious assessment of what they like or don't like, this type of data is generally produced, mostly unknowingly, by users as they go about their online business. According to engineers of algorithms, this kind of data is also much more trustworthy. So users are more likely to dissemble in public ratings, right? They might claim that they found War and Peace to be the most fascinating book that they've ever read and give it 5 stars, even though they've never actually read it, right? Nor would they click on recommendations that are based on a book similarity with War and Peace. But activity logs are harder to falsify. Engineers have also found there's a natural limit to predictive accuracy when tracking user ratings, since user ratings are themselves variable. So let's say you have read War and Peace. One month you might give it 5 stars, the next month you might give it 4 stars. So the algorithms that are operating on that kind of explicit data are already set up in some ways for failure. Furthermore, researchers have found that increasing the accuracy of predicted ratings for a given product doesn't always lead to user satisfaction. So in other words, users don't always want to be recommended items that they might rate highly. This is really interesting and important because it means that the pre-programmed goals of algorithms on sites like Amazon are likely not to increase sales, but simply to increase the time we spend on the site because that will produce more usable data, which is of value. And I'll talk more about that in the second section. Although we can't know all of the ways that Amazon collects data to power its bookselling algorithms, we do know of several proprietary sources. The first is Amazon's e-reading device, the Kindle. When readers use the Kindle, they produce a digital data trail made up of information on pages turned, time spent reading, pages left unread, that is uploaded to Amazon servers. Like other e-commerce platforms, Amazon is also able to collect data from users who search and click through its own site, but it has vastly increased this data pool by buying several competing bookish sites, like A-Books, which was launched in 1996 and bought by Amazon in 2008, and Goodreads, which was launched in 2007 and bought in 2013. So these sites, and particularly Goodreads, offer that explicit data, which is like the ratings, the reviews, the tagging of books, right? How you can shelve books into, um, particular tags, along with that implicit data of users clicking, scrolling, and time spent on book pages. And so when I say book pages here, I mean that um, the book's dedicated page on the website. So this is sort of like a skeuomorphism, right? Where the time you spend on the book page online becomes something like a proxy for the money that you might spend buying the actual book of pages in real life. So imagine now that a bookseller has access to the data that Amazon's algorithms do. This bookseller knows exactly how many seconds you've spent looking at all of these book pages. This bookseller even has the ability and desire to curate a bookstore for your particular proclivities and possesses those statistical formulas for the models that would allow her to do so. How long might this take? So, for the computing power of algorithms, it takes seconds, right? This is why they're used in the first place. In 2008, Chris Anderson wrote that the amount of data and computing power available to algorithms would change our epistemological attitude towards the world. We would no longer need to build simplified models and test them against the complexities of reality. For example, I'll put out this book on the main table and I'll see how it does, right? And then tomorrow I'll come in and I might change my mind. Instead, the complexities of the world could just be computed in real time. For example, as people are buying or not buying a book featured on the homepage, that book can be instantly changed for particular users or segments of users in real time. So the best option, as modeled through a statistical formula applied to a data set, could be constantly recomputed, no guessing required. Anderson calls this the end of theory. Although models help us understand the world, Anderson argues, with algorithms, understanding becomes overrated. Quote, who knows why people do what they do? The point is they do it, and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. Although Anderson's claim here has to do with scale, creating, like in Jorge Luis Borges' story about exactitude in science, a one-to-one map of reality, it also has to do with time. It is the instantaneity of the computation that allows it to create an up-to-the-second map of our world. Of course, as I talk about more in the element, this view ignores the fact that statistics is a heuristic, historically rooted in a desire to predict the future using whatever data proxy from the past is available. Similarly, but also obviously very differently from fiction, which often uses knowledge of the past to project a model of reality, algorithms quantify the future within adjustable ranges of deviation using the most available data proxies. So there is another way in which the massive scale of Amazon's data interacts with the real time of reality. The synchronic logic of algorithmic categorization is slow to detect and reflect changes that happen in our world. Because algorithms accrue data over time, historical data amasses, right? It becomes larger and larger and larger and larger. New data, a new data point, becomes an ever shrinking percentage of the input used to make a recommendation or return a search result. EdFin, for example, shows that historical syllabi data is embedded in Amazon's cross recommendations on product pages of often assigned books, and that these affiliations may be very slow to change. So, here, for example, this is from the book page of 1984 by George Orwell. You can see that these recommendations, some of them, right, like Animal Farm, obviously have something to do with the similarity between books, but other recommendations here seem to have more to do with the fact that these books are all required reading on historical syllabi. So as those syllabi change, this data changes much more slowly. Here's another example of that. This is from the book page of The Great Gatsby, which includes recommendations for Othello and Romeo and Juliet. Right? I would love to read the paper that actually argues that they are extremely similar books, but I think what's more likely is that this is a remnant, right, of student purchases. Okay, so algorithms are programmed not to take risks. Are programmed not to take risks, but that means they aren't programmed to anticipate our development as readers and people. As Taina Bucher records one YouTube user saying, algorithms, quote, are just based on trends and past behavior. It can't predict for you in the future. It just assumes you are going to repeat everything you've done in the past. Although algorithms use probabilities to predict the future, those predictions are based only on past data, of course, right? That's an obvious statement because there is no such thing as future data. Not the foundational assumption that people change. Although algorithms undoubtedly shape our future by offering us limited recommendations of what we might read next, they operate as though the future doesn't exist, or at least that it will fit into the same categories within some range of deviation that it always has in the past. So, in many ways, recommendation algorithms and human booksellers share similar aims: to match readers and books, to increase traffic, and to capture book buyers. They may even consider many of the same factors in concluding what books to feature or recommend. A major distinction due to algorithmic quantification of human behavior is the speed and automaticity of algorithms' results. This is, I want to argue, a non trivial difference. Speed, or rather its absence, is central or has been central to our cultural understanding of what a book, and as Jessica Pressman puts it, bookishness, is. Reading a book compared to downloading a file is, quote, a slow form of exchange. Pressman quotes Christina Lupton as saying that there's a slowing down, a repetition, a promise associated with book reading that pulls back on the logic of accumulation and acceleration and the measurement of time. Although paradoxically, algorithms are slow to reflect changes happening offline, speed of search, of recommendation, of delivery is the logic valorized by Amazon. So speed is not just incidental to algorithms, it's their fundamental affordance, and it shapes our relationship to books, bookstores, and the humans who populate them. The logic of accumulation and acceleration is key to Amazon's epic narrative, as Mark McGurl writes, in which its great quasi imperial sprawl and seemingly unbounded ambition to multinational, if not multi-planetary commercial presence keeps an eventual narrative denouement at bay. In fact, slowing down is the number one threat to Amazon's hegemony of the book world. As Kate Crawford records, quote, Bezos is worried. Jeff Bezos, of course, is the founder, owner of Amazon. Bezos is worried. His fear is that the planet's growing energy demands will soon outstrip its limited supply. For him, the greatest concern is not necessarily extinction, but stasis. We will have to stop growing, which I think is a very bad future. So Amazon's algorithms work by processing large amounts of data, as I've just discussed, data that's produced primarily through the clicks, scrolls, purchases, ratings, and reviews of its users and users on Goodreads and other affiliate sites. In effect, the profit Amazon reaps by supplanting the labor of salespeople who find and recommend books in a bookstore is made possible through a combination of the work of paid programmers and the unpaid contributions of its users, who devote some of their time freely fueling algorithms and therefore the profitability of Amazon. This circularity, using data generated by users to market to those same users, is essentially the basis of the online economy, in which sites are free for users because they are paying for them with their own data production. We could argue that users do this because it benefits them as well. Users enter, as Astrid Mager writes, an alliance to reach their goal of conveniently finding a book while providing data to algorithms and making a profit for Amazon. And this type of user behavior of collectively producing or crowdsourcing information that remains freely accessible, such as on rating and review sites or Wikipedia, does have a long history on the internet. But Amazon then monetizes this behavior, and it does so, of course, without paying users. When Goodreads users shelve books, they provide Amazon with data about that book, but also about themselves as consumers. Although some argue that value is not created by the users producing data, but by the manipulation and computation of that data, Valerie Jarrett insists that it is the fact that value is extracted from user contributions that transforms such activity from work, activity creating objects with embedded meaningful value to the user, into labor, activity producing goods defined primarily by their value in a marketplace. This is the trade-off of shopping on Amazon, buying often heavily discounted products with convenient shipping times in exchange for the free use of our unpaid labor. End-user license agreements and terms of service define this relationship between users and the companies who extract value from our data. Although user labor is certainly exploited by Amazon, users, of course, have relative autonomy. They're not required to work set hours or produce a certain number of clicks. In fact, they're not required to work at all. And there are very few rules about how users should work while they are working. Although there are incitements to work in certain ways, algorithms subtly discipline our behaviors in ways that produce the most value for them. However, there remains little transparency about how the product of our work, our data, is used and how our actions implicate us in a larger system of value production. An example of the difficulty of imagining users as laborers is made somewhat more visible in the rise of fast food ordering kiosks and grocery self checkout lanes. It appears as though these machines have replaced the worker with automation, when what they've really done is relocate the site of labor from the paid employee to the unpaid customer. So, as we've seen before, when selling books with algorithms, it comes down to time and to speed. Bezos' 2020 shareholder letter claims that 28% of purchases on Amazon are made in 3 minutes or less, pointing to the extreme convenience the shopping environment provides. 50% of purchases are made in less than a quarter of an hour. Compare that, this now is a quote from Bezos, compare that, Bezos urges, to the typical shopping trip to a physical store. Driving, parking, searching store aisles, waiting in the checkout line, finding your car. I'm sure he has a very unremarkable car that's very difficult to find in a parking lot, and then driving home. He calculates that Amazon saves the average consumer about 75 hours a year. But the calculation that is missing here is that in Bezos' scenario, this average consumer will have provided Amazon with 13 hours of unpaid data production in this year. And that's just time spent shopping on the site. It doesn't include data produced on the Kindle, on Alexa, the Ring camera, other wearables, etc. Bezos, whose company made over 380 billion in 2020, ends this part of his letter by acknowledging that yes, quote, we are all busy in the early 21st century. But what he fails to acknowledge is that some people just get paid more for their time than others. So this brings me to the warehouse associates. So while algorithms on Amazon discipline the labor of users as they navigate the site, they do so at the will of the user, who can log off at any time without penalty. This is not the case with the workers in Amazon distribution centers, whose work is regimented by algorithms which dictate their paths through the shelves, tally minutes working and not working, and optimize their movements. Emily Gwendelsberger, a journalist who worked as a seasonal associate during peak, which is a word describing the high sales season from November through January. She writes that the first thing pickers do when they enter the warehouse is to pick up a scan gun, which communicates the location of products to workers while collecting data and tracking their location, even as workers take trips to the bathroom, which are labeled as time off task. Gwendelsberger records that she walked up to 16 miles per day, tracking down objects in the shelves, as the LCD screen on the scan gun showed, quote, a blue bar that gets shorter and shorter as your remaining seconds tick by. So you can see that bar in the lower part of the image there. Speed is the name of the game. Products, including books, are distributed across the warehouse, each with a scannable barcode. Their arrangement on the shelves, unlike that of a bookstore, is not designed to be navigated by people. This is called random distribution, and it's determined by algorithms that weigh factors like frequency of orders, the size and the shape of the item, along with what items are often purchased together. Although the result of a computed best output, item locations seem random to human understanding and may change without notice. This makes the warehouse computationally efficient, but makes it completely incomprehensible to humans, who, in stark contrast to the browser in the bookstore, needs to rely on the scan gun to direct all of their movements. Heike Geisler, a writer who, like Wendelsberger, worked as a seasonal associate, records a manager telling her, quote, you don't have to understand it, by the way. You just have to know it. Although this statement reflects the dehumanization of the worker in the warehouse, who is told to simply rely on algorithmic outputs rather than her own comprehension, it is just as applicable to the site's user, who is asked not to think so much about why books are being recommended, but to accept that these are the books that are suitable. And this is where I was going to make a little bit of a Star Wars joke, like these are not the droids that you're looking for. In any case, it's a Friday, right? So the most important data point gathered in the warehouses is the number of products successfully unpacked from incoming deliveries, picked, this is the word that's used, picked from the warehouse shelves, or packaged for outgoing delivery to customers. This is called the rate. and it's a productivity measure calculated by a proprietary software system called ADAPT. The rate is an ever changing target computed both for individuals and for entire shifts, which means that workers are encouraged to pressure each other to perform faster. If a worker's rate is repeatedly low, they're reprimanded and eventually risk being fired. Workers report skipping bathroom breaks to make rate. Managers sometimes revoke talking privileges until workers start making rate, which can be tracked in real time using the data produced by the scan guns. By disciplining or firing workers who don't make rate, some factories are able to hit coveted targets, which are celebrated with commemorative t shirts, like the Eastvale factory in California, which recently hit 1 million packages processed in 24 hours. The algorithmically processed and produced rate, which adjusts according to various inputs, is the flip side of the recommendation algorithms on Amazon's site. Although they are weighing different inputs, both optimize human behavior according to the logics of speed. How fast can you show a user the book they will buy? Or how fast can you get a human to find and package a book? Geisler's description of her trainer at the warehouse in Leipzig, Germany, shows this optimization in action. Norman's movements follow a strict sense of timing. He seems to use the exact amount of time for each activity. Everything is subordinated to his sense of time, and each product to be processed is merely something that impairs the adherence to time requirements more or less than others. Here, objects like books become not even commodities, representing exchange value, but simply in their material existence, physical barriers to speed. Even though Amazon started out primarily as a bookseller, the time of the Amazon distribution center is the antithesis of reading time. Geisler treats the job as market research, becoming familiar with the reading tendency of German customers, noting the popularity of humorous health writer Eckhart von Hirschhausen and the incredible number of vampire novels. So she's an author, right? And she's seeing these books and sort of thinking about what she should write next, given the popularity of the books that she's seeing in the warehouse. But after Geisler is chastised for reading when she should be scanning, of course, is sort of another form of reading, right? Letting the computer read the barcode. She writes, "You're not inherently against optimization either. You just don't usually think of optimizing actions. I've never taken a course in speed reading or speed typing. Still, you attempt to make more effort. You stop examining books. You're only interested in speed. It's a kind of downhill race. You make yourself thin, reject all temptation to open up one of the books. But after half an hour, you lose focus, and then you do open up another book, reading a few lines and relaxing." Geisler's use of both the first and second person here reveal that the rate and the books themselves are hailing two different subjects. One is the alienated subject of algorithmic work time, and the other is the subject engaged in the slow time of reading. The logic of speed in selling books with algorithms makes its most brutal mark on the bodies of Amazon employees. As we've seen, the control over time is a consistent theme in the Amazon logistical empire. And as Kate Crawford adds, quote, "The bodies of workers are run according to the cadences of computational logics." It is in the distribution centers where the time it takes to move objects through space and across distance in the visible material world meets the algorithmic time of nearly instantaneous decisions made by clicks and computations that are invisible to us. Where these worlds meet, they produce friction, usually at the cost of the worker. Repetitive motion and strain injuries are so common in the warehouses that Amazon provides free vending machines stocked with over-the-counter painkillers. These were introduced after lines at the medical office made it difficult to navigate through key corridors of the warehouse. After workers in a Minnesota warehouse walked out, Amazon came to the negotiating table to discuss their issues, but said that it would not be able to discuss changing the rate, which was determined algorithmically and therefore not subject to human intervention. This is a common appeal to the objectivity of algorithms, right? They know something we don't know. They're operating in a way that we can't understand. And so if we intervene, we're going to ruin the effectiveness of the algorithm. If a single warehouse negotiated a different rate, it would threaten Amazon's global ordering of time, throwing the warehouses out of sync. The rate, like Greenwich Mean Time, which structured the rule of the British Empire before it, the rate then consolidates the power of Amazon into a global daily rhythm. Amazon is, according to Bezos himself, quote, developing new automated staffing schedules that use sophisticated algorithms to rotate employees among jobs that use different muscle tendon groups to decrease repetitive motion. In addition, the company has bought Kiva, a robotics company, in order to develop automated robots who will move between pickers, standing ready at shelves with objects, and packers, limiting the number of miles walked by humans each day. So, although selling books with algorithms appears to buyers as a seamless interaction taking place at roughly the speed and materiality of light, this is because the material effects of bookselling have become displaced. It is important, I think, to make visible what selling books with algorithms removes from our immediate consciousness in order to consider whose time it is that is being saved and how this algorithmic revolution has transformed our relationship to the world, to the book, and to each other. All right, I'm entering my conclusion now. So, our encounters with algorithms online are primarily concerned with speeding up the process of discovery. In the bricks and mortar bookstore, we call this process of discovery browsing. The English word browse comes from an old French word meaning to crop and eat or graze on vegetation. It was not until the 19th century that the word came to mean to examine or look through various books in a library, bookshop, etc., especially in a casual or leisurely manner. Ultimately, of course, the word has come to include the perusal of all sorts of items in a store. So browse is akin to words like ruminate, which metaphorize the actions of animals to describe a slow human action. That the perusal of books was the conduit of the transformation of browsing into a human action means, of course, it must have been something we habitually did slowly and over some time. Jeff Deutsch argues, in fact, that the experience of browsing is the primary product of the good bookstore, and that booksellers, quote, cultivate readers as farmers tend their fields. This pastoral and spatial metaphor that imagines farmers as nurturing and growing, but also disciplining and ordering their reader seeds, is repeated in a slightly different form by John Thompson, who characterizes the rise of Amazon and online bookselling from the perspective of publishers, who were, quote, slow to wake up to the fact that readers were migrating to new pastures where others were busy tending the flocks. They struggle to understand the lay of the land. Here, readers become sheep rather than plants, right, picking up on that browsing metaphor directly, and those trying to sell the books are shepherds rather than farmers, but this bucolic idea of tending fields or pastures as a metaphor for growing a readership is repeated. Programmers of algorithms have also used the pastoral as metaphor. Nick Seaver, who is a what's the word? He does like ethnographies of the engineers that produce these algorithms. He's an anthropologist. Nick Seaver records a metaphor he found repeated in his conversations with programmers. Quote, learning algorithms are the seeds, data is the soil, and the learned programs are the grown plants. The machine learning expert is like a farmer, sowing the seeds, irrigating and fertilizing the soil, and keeping an eye on the health of the crop, but otherwise staying out of the way. Elsewhere, Seaver mentions the metaphor of the park ranger, guiding visitors through an environment based on their interests, as well as the shepherd tending their flock. Wendy Chun similarly mentions that the rhizomatic growth of networked clusters and statistical data modeling seems to invite techniques of management like pruning. These shared metaphors point out the similarities in bricks and mortar and algorithmic bookselling. Both envision themselves as enacting what Rosalind Cooper calls pastoral power, a power defined by a duty of care and minimal intervention, responsive to the need of all of its charges as a collectivity and on the level of the individual. So algorithmic bookselling is not doing something fundamentally new when it manipulates our reading choices, although I think the fact that it does so in a way that resists critique is important. The similarity is reflected in the fact that we access Amazon through our browser, which allows us to peruse online sites casually, right, and at our leisure. The difference, then, is in the privileging of rapidity, a logic seemingly inimical to the idea of the ruminating browse. Browsing with algorithms is designed for targeted efficiency. Algorithms show a limited number of options and respond to our clicks with another set of options designed to get us to a felicitous destination. Although the paths seem infinite, they are by design very constrained. If you see 4 recommendations on each page, it will take you 25 clicks to see 100 books, many of which will repeat due to the algorithm's desire to personalize its results. It will take you far fewer than 25 paces to see 100 books in a bookstore. The reader, as imagined by Amazon, is not an ambling flaneur, but a rational consumer out to obtain desired goods at the lowest possible cost in terms of both price and time spent. In this model, the reader becomes, like algorithms, a rational machine, weighing factors and optimizing results. Although book buyers frequent online bookstores at a higher rate than traditional bookstores, likely due to convenience and the cost of travel, they generally spend a shorter time on each visit, leading to a notable decrease in serendipitous impulse buying. The pastoral metaphors, when used by programmers, ignore the sense of slow time controlled by natural cycles out of the hands of metaphorical farmers or shepherds. The seeds planted by programmers are subject only to the instantaneous cycles of data collection, not to the time it takes their charges to read a book or carve a path through a bookstore. So it would perhaps be too much to point to the slow or immersive time of traditional book buying as an antithesis to or a utopic relief from the ravages of neoliberal speed. However, I think we should be alert to what extent selling books with algorithms represents a colonization of a space previously somewhat guarded from this logic, at least in our cultural imaginary. Pressman claims that, quote, in our neoliberal times in which digital corporations invade our private space and reading time, claiming a bookish identity can constitute an act of rebellion, self-construction, and hope within this sphere. I'm suggesting that when that bookish identity is shaped by the recommendations of bookselling algorithms, autonomous self-construction is less ensured. When we unquestioningly accept a book recommendation from an algorithm, we privilege a computational view of ourselves operating within a logic of speed and optimization. Some scholars suggest that we do this because of time pressure. Algorithms offer a computational hack for the cognitive effort that tasks like choosing a book requires. At what point, though, and this is where I sort of wax poetic given our current world, at what point, though, are activities defined by the spending of time, like reading, browsing, learning, loving, nurturing, caring, no longer recognizable because they've been optimized and routinized, co-opted as data by a machine ostensibly programmed to save you time? Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Anna. Um, so the puns are unavoidable. We have time for questions. I hate myself. Uh, um, I did have one comment, or maybe it's a question. I don't know. I've recently been looking at the origins of the kind of the debate around browsing and its kind of entry into like bookselling, kind of as a concept, like, and with like booksellers kind of bickering in trade journals about like, pro browsing, anti browsing. And it is interesting how the pastoral carries into that, and also food, weirdly enough, because it's often framed as a lunchtime activity, like people on their lunch breaks and browsing and not purchasing. But to the pastoral point, one I'm forgetting where I saw this. There's a cartoon of a someone complaining about browsing, and the cartoon is a cow with its hooves up on a bookshelf, browsing books. It's kind of like on the nose. But anyhow, so I just thought you might like that. If I find it, I'll send it to you.
Yes, please do. I think
Yeah.
that's really interesting. Yeah.
So do we have any questions? Also, feel free to ask a question in the chat as well. Oh, Gail, please go ahead.
Yeah, I should just say that it's a complete accident that I have a cow in the background. This is also metaphorical. This, I must just say, sorry, it's totally off the point, really, but this cow is a Polish cow who escaped from its crate on the way to the abattoir and swam to an island in the middle of a lake where it resisted rearrest. And so I'm always very fond of that. Anyway, yes, what was I going to say? Oh, yes. Well, first of all, I thought what you were saying earlier on was very interesting about early algorithms telling you about what had passed, because I was very struck by the fact that I had just bought a washing machine, and then I kept getting all these adverts to buy a washing machine. Like, what's the point of that, you know? So that was very interesting thought. But the other thing, just relating to your time point, and you've kind of addressed this, but I'd like you to say a bit more, is that, okay, somebody spends, I don't know, 10 minutes or something on Amazon buying a book. But what about, you know, the research and the thinking and whatever before you get to Amazon? I mean, it could be, I suppose, that, you know, somebody just wants a bit of light romantic fiction for the day, you know, and then they can do that in 5 minutes. But if you're thinking about what you might buy, then maybe you're not going to click on those 25 books that you said. But you know, that strikes me anyway as time that you would be spending, apart from the actual time buying the book on Amazon.
Are you talking about sort of researching what book you're going to buy on Amazon?
Well, or not. I mean, not necessarily. I tend to, I mean, sometimes I go to Amazon, I use it as a research base. I never buy off it. I was buy off bookshop.org, but you know, I've an idea of the kind of thing I'm looking for. I'm more likely to find it by browsing more generally on the internet, you know, or looking on bookfinder.com or something like that.
Yeah, so I have two things to say. One is actually about that thing that you said originally about the washing machine. So when the products that are, you know, if you're looking at a certain book page, and then you have recommendations for other books, those are called cross recommendations. And the purpose of those is often not to get you to click on one of those, but for you to believe that the book that you are on is suitable for you, because it might say something like similar books to this one, and then one that you've already bought. And you think, well, if this is similar to the one I've already bought, then maybe I should buy this one too, right? So for, you know, algorithms, part of the factors that go into this on Amazon may be to show you things that you've already bought so that you find the things that you're looking at more suitable because they are related to things that you've already purchased. And so this presents you with a vision of yourself as, this is sometimes called like the algorithmic gaze, where we are sort of taught, there's enough gazes right in the world, but we talk about the algorithmic gaze where we see ourselves, you know, as being approved by the algorithm in some way, right? Oh, great. I was thinking about buying this book and the algorithm is telling me that it's similar to this book I've already bought. Perfect. It must be correct, right? This must be a correct choice. And so that's sort of, you know, strategic, I think, in a way too. And in terms of this time you spend researching, right? All of that, I think what I'm trying to point out here is that all of that time that you spent online looking at things, especially through the use of cookies and things like that, can be used by Amazon, can be used by other companies, right? This data is bought and sold. So that was part of the idea that we're always in our clicking and scrolling and stuff producing value, even if Amazon doesn't end up using that, which of course they would for their own algorithms, they can sell that, right? Or use it to increase the cost of their own of other companies' advertisements on their own sites, right? The more that they know about you, the more effective advertising is, and the more that they can charge for advertisers on their sites. So there's a lot of ways that they can leverage that kind of data, even if you could never buy a book on Amazon, right? And you're still producing value for them in that sense.
Simon?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting in terms of thinking about geological time for Amazon. So if we look back to the idea of books and print being kind of foundational text for what books are available, and the fact that you can look at older books on Amazon and buy them for a second-hand version. So there are these kind of geological layers that you don't see in most bricks and mortar retailers, because there's not that capacity in the same way that the everything store has. But then thinking about the algorithms, it's very much kind of just on the surface level that you don't really dig in. So there is that kind of accumulation of kind of predictive modeling over time, but then it's only chiseling so deep into those geological layers. So do you think there's a missed opportunity there for Amazon, particularly thinking about, for example, the Kindle's launch and finding older books that would be sellable at reasonable prices, where they could make back that $200 that they had to spend to digitize each of those books?
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. So you're saying why aren't the algorithms like presenting these sorts of like older print books that aren't newer? Is that sort of the
So kind of the opposite, that there's this whole historical data set on Amazon, but the recommendations are very much, if you looked at the examples you were given, they're the newest editions. They're not kind of older editions, and there could be something of kind of finding markets for books that are out of print or were in print at one point and then resurfacing.
Yeah, and that's sort of like the entire idea behind algorithms and like Amazon as the everything store, right? Is that it allows the long tail of book production to be available, right? So in your normal bookstore, you can see 50,000, maybe like in one of those mega stores, 150,000 books, and Amazon has, as you're mentioning, like all books, right? Or they say they do, right? All books, all of the past editions, etc. And the idea is, right, that this allows you to go on and find esoteric things. But of course, it's actually not that easy always, right? Because it's giving you these search results and recommendations that are in some ways engineered for like a typical buyer and what it knows about you. So the more you use it, you're going to get more and more specific results. I think that the reason that it doesn't sort of suggest to you older versions of books is because those are not as profitable probably for it, right? And it knows that people will click through and find those those used versions or those out of print versions probably themselves. So I am not an expert on this. Justin Joke has a great book on sort of the political economy of algorithms. It's called, I can't remember it, but here I'll put his name in the chat. And so he talks in a very accessible way about the Bayesian statistics, like the Bayesian probability models that fuel these algorithms. And so I'm going to give I talk about this in the element. I'm going to give my like 2-cent version of this. So there's what's known as frequentist statistics, right? Which is like the statistics you learn in elementary school where you flip a coin and it's heads or tails and you measure it. And if, you do it 100 times and you come up with like around 50 heads, and then you assume in the future it will be 50, right? And so that's basically how that you're measuring, you're guessing what the future is going to be like based on the past. The problem with recommendations is you can't do that, right? So if I've bought David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, I'm probably not going to buy it again, right? So there's not like suddenly 100% chance that that's the next book I'm going to buy. In fact, it's probably a 0% chance that that's the next book I'm going to buy. So it works in a different way. So what Bayesian statistics does is it begins with a what's sometimes interestingly called a subjective belief or a prior belief of what is going to happen next. And then each time, and you can only do this because of the computing power that these algorithms have access to, each time someone makes a click or a purchase or whatever, it updates that belief. Okay, there's like A or B, click or not click. This is what happened, and it updates the belief in real time. And so that's what it uses to predict the next action that you're going to take. And so what Justin Joke argues is that whatever the prior belief, the subjective belief, is set in advance, and it's likely, right, we don't know because we don't have access to Amazon's algorithms, it's likely set to the most profitable option. So that's the option it's going to give you first. And then if you beg off of that option and say, that's not the option I'm going to pick, it will give you an updated set of options. But of course, it's always going to be designed to create profit, either in terms of the books it's selling or in the amount of the data that it's getting. So it might also be giving you options that will provide it with the best kind of data. So it might, like the first time you go on the site, you might get like, a romance, a horror, a nonfiction book, right? And you might like that is a huge amount of data, right? To give it on the first click, say, well, actually, I'm a romance reader. Okay, now it has a huge amount of data about you. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question. It's interesting to think about. Of course, they can be algorithms can be programmed with different goals, right? So that's something I mentioned in the element two. You could imagine an algorithm that doesn't prioritize that kind of value and that offers, makes it easier for users to access like past editions or out of print works and things like that. But I don't think that's obviously the fact that it doesn't tells us something about how those algorithms are programmed and what they value.
Other questions? I guess I mean I had one kind of I mean obviously kind of more responsible publishers are probably anticipating this in some way. I mean how are they? I guess that's the question. How are publishers kind of anticipating how these algorithms work in order to kind of improve their chances of selling more? Do you have any sense of this? Or
Yeah,
selling better?
so how publishers, so one thing, I mean, there's all these ways of algorithms are work through optimizing, right? They're like optimizing outputs, but they're also like they train us, right, to optimize our inputs for them. So one thing that publishers now do, of course, is they produce the metadata in a way that, that metadata that they feed into Amazon is designed to get the most uptake by the algorithms. And that's, for example, I know that they'll put in the sort of descriptions words that are trending, right? Trending in the searches and things like that, so that it will draw out those books more easily. So there are ways, this, like I mentioned, this is called systems gaming, and there's ways that authors do it too on the site for the self-published arm of Amazon's publishing. Publishers can do it too. We do it sometimes, every time you sit there and you put in a search term and you're like, well, that didn't get me what I wanted. What do I think the algorithm needs to hear from me in order to give me what I want, right? You are changing your behavior. You're being disciplined by the algorithm in a way to produce it with the data that it wants in a way. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is, I think maybe something that people don't realize so much is that publishers do pay Amazon, right, quite a significant cut in order to be treated equally by its algorithms. And if they refuse, which has happened in the past, their books are not featured in algorithmic in those search results, which really hits their profit margin. They brag about the fact that it usually takes about 30 days for publishers to come back and start paying them the co-op fees, right? And you can see that almost all of the recommendations, the algorithmic recommendations have that sponsored tag on them, which means that publishers are paying for their books to be visible there. And this sort of thing is why that claim to algorithmic objectivity and superiority is, obviously false, because they're constantly being manipulated, right? Those algorithms are constantly being manipulated in ways that benefit Amazon. So to say to those workers, oh, we can't touch it because it's out of our hands is not the case.
Sounds like a protection racket. It's Sam, you had a question?
It's kind of an unfair question, really, Anna. I'm just going to preface by saying that. But I mean, just again, and I've read the element and then hearing you kind of, restate some of these things, it's still shocking to hear things like, 30, Amazon is claiming 13 hours of unpaid time by us. That's just, it sort of blows your mind. I suppose my question is I mean, where do you think the future, does this affect in terms of physical bookshops, put us 10 years in the future, can you use your knowledge of algorithms to kind of come up with a prediction of where we're going to be in 10 years' time? You can say, Sam, that is an unfair question. No, we can't, and that's perfectly fine, Anna.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, right, I could ask you all how many of us have bought a book on Amazon. I'm sure it's all of us, right? And so I think it's really easy to critique Amazon, and it's really hard not to buy books on Amazon. I mean, what would be ideal is that you have some of these affordances of right. Algorithms do let us see what's out there. They do let us search for things. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Like this is sort of like, you know, treating this technology not as so technologically deterministic, right? To say, well, it can only be used for these sort of evil ends, right? But you know, it could be used for much better ends, I think. You use right bookshop. Gail mentioned bookshop.org. They use algorithms, right? Also, and you know, buying on bookshop.org feels a lot better than buying on Amazon. But what I guess what I would like to see, this is not exactly your question, but what I would like to see is like an online book buying situation in which the algorithms are like privilege different sorts of things, like surprise, right? They can be made to do that. They can be made
Yeah.
to prioritize randomness, right? Or different sorts of things that we value in in-person book stores as well, right? Finding something you didn't know you were looking for is very difficult on Amazon because, you know, because of the way that those algorithms work. So I think that it would be really interesting if we could use some of those positive affordances of algorithms and produce something that doesn't feel like it is always just trying to make us optimize our book browsing experience.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Anna.
And Eleanor?
Yeah, thank you. And sorry about the Nancy Eleanor. I couldn't change it. It is Eleanor. Thank you. Really fascinating talk, Anna. I actually was going to ask about the algorithms with bookshop.org, you know, but I was also wondering, now that Amazon owns Goodreads, is there any interaction between the like their algorithms for book selling with Goodreads? Because I would think that you would be able to collate and do something there. And you know, my students are always they're shocked when they find out Goodreads is also now owned by Amazon. And we have seen a real difference for those of you who buy more rare books or older books on Abe Books, now that, you know, Amazon has sold that, has bought that too.
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that they use the data collected from Goodreads and AbeBooks, you know, in their sales algorithms on Amazon. And there's a great quote. It's from Simone Murray's piece of a you know, a Goodreads mega user who is like, you know, how could we not anticipate that all of this bookish work we were doing here, right, which isn't work when you're doing it as a hobbyist with a group of like-minded people, right? All this work we're doing, rating, reviewing, shelving for each other could just be colonized in this way and then, you know, fed into the algorithms and used to make money, essentially, right? So yeah, I have no doubt that they use those. And in fact, now you can see on Amazon, this is fairly recent, I think the last year or so, you can see Goodreads ratings and reviews on the Amazon book pages themselves. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. Another round of applause for a really like wonderful talk and discussion. Thank you very much.
Well,